So just to try to explain the difference between the public domain and the private domain, and one of the things is that we can allocate things before we do something, before we put something out there, what it is that the thing is supposed to remain within, as in what are the boundaries, what are the borders, what can it remain within, where can it go? So, for example, if we tell somebody something, then if they are expected to keep that a secret, they need to be told before they're told what it is. Can you keep a secret? Can I tell you something in confidence? It's not acceptable to effectively put something into the public domain and then afterwards say, no, it's confidential, you can't tell anybody. Rather, once something is put into the public domain, that's it, it's in the public domain. If somebody sends something out to somebody else, then they've put it in the public domain, and where they've given it to, they not necessarily responsible for what they for what they cannot do with it. And so before we put something into the public domain, we need to decide, do we want this to go to public? Do we mind if it's passed on to anybody else? Now, obviously, we're normally referring to something like, for example, telling somebody something, but it could be more private information regarding a business transaction, or maybe it's just gossip, but we have the obligation to decide what can happen to it before we put it out there. And I'm mentioning this with regards to Torah, partly on Shabas, for example. We're allowed to carry something into, say, for example, a komeles, which is like in between a private domain and a public domain. So let's just look at what each are. For example, in a private home, then obviously if we're in somebody's home, we know this is a private domain. We're allowed to carry from one private domain into another private domain, although we can't carry it into the public unless there's an eruv, which makes it a part of a komeles for the purposes of carrying. But that's not the same as putting it down. We can't put it down and leave it there. That would be carrying it into the public domain, which we can't do on Shabbos. Now, it's actually quite interesting because there is something in between a private domain and a public domain, which we call a komeles. And I'm just giving an example that we go into a courtyard in between a house. It might be that there's a car apartment which is shared with the neighboring block of apartments. And so depending on the exact enclosure around the entrance to the car park, it might be a footpath, it might be a driveway, it might all be open. There might be an enclosure whereby it's marked and effectively gated off or separated with walls and edges, whereby this makes it private, but not in a completely private domain, as in anybody could walk into it, but it is owned communally by the people that have the private domains there. So a car park which is shared owned is, for example, a different type of public domain than walking on the high street. And a restaurant, for example, or a shop is owned by the people that own it or have a lease on it, for the purposes of the example, whereby anybody could walk into the shop, yet somebody owns it. It is their private domain, yet they open it up to the public. So it is not public owned property, it is not a public domain, but it's a private domain. It's owned privately, but anybody can come into it. This makes it a kind of komeles, whereby it's not in the public domain. Now, if we look at what some of the things we can and can't do on Shabbos, for example, we can't carry into the public domain, but we can carry through a public domain. We just can't put down or pick up from a public domain and carry it into a private domain. Now, there's a lot of things we can and can't do on Shabbos, like, for example, we are not supposed to fast on Shabbos. But in act, people want to have 3 meals on Shabbos. But if somebody doesn't want to eat on Shabbos, are they allowed to be forced? Do they have to eat? Do they really have to eat bread? I'm holding by they don't have to eat bread to elevate the Shabbos. But what if that is like effectively Shabbos becoming a public domain, whereas Hashem wanted Shabbos to be a private domain, whereby effectively in our own house we can do whatever we want. This is like being in the house of Hashem. This is inside Hashem's house. On the Shabbos, we've got the 6 days of the week corresponding to Zeir Anpin, and they all overflow into the Malchus. So how do we bring the Malchus into our life? How do we bring the Shabbos into our everyday life? We basically need to make every domain our private domain. And that means maintaining our own privacy even when we're in public. We can make the public domain private. It doesn't mean we can carry to it on Shabbos. Doesn't mean we can put things down in Shabbos, in the public domain on Shabbos. Rather, we can make the public domain private to us